Good evening. I'm Stephen Barktis, the curator of the Gunn Historical Museum in Washington, Connecticut. Thank you for joining us for Raising the Curtain, the History of Theater in Washington. The Dramalites are co-sponsoring this lecture with us. This evening, Sarah Griswold, our distinguished guest, will share the very interesting story of theatrics here in Washington. Jean Solomon, a trustee of the Gunn Memorial Library and Museum, will be introducing her. During this lecture, we ask that you please mute both your audio and video settings. If you have questions, you may submit them throughout the lecture in the chat box, and Sarah will answer some of them at the end. Please note that our next guest lecturers are Renee Jarowski and Matt Kent, co-artistic directors of Palabolis, the innovative dance company located here in Washington, who will present Palabolis Origins on Monday, January 17th, 2022 at 6:30 p.m. on Zoom. This lecture will be the second of a two-part series on performing arts in Washington that we are presenting. Please mark your calendars and register for this presentation on the Gunn Museum's website. Now, I'd like to hand it over to Jean.
Hello and good evening. My name is Jean Solomon. It is my great pleasure to welcome our guest lecturer, Sarah Griswold, a graduate of the Wickham Rise School as an art major back in what she calls the school's golden age. Sarah is an independent consultant and mentor to cultural and nonprofit organizations throughout Connecticut. Recent clients include the Institute for American Indian Studies and many others. She is a board member of the Mary and Eliza Freeman Center for History and Community in Bridgeport. She is also project director for the Arthur Miller Writing Studio planned for the grounds of the Roxbury Public Library. Previously, she served as curator of the Gunn Historical Museum and curated an exhibit on Washington, Connecticut's theater during her tenure there. She also previously served as executive director for the Seabury Society for the Preservation of the Glebe House in Woodbury, Connecticut. Thank you, Sarah, for your participation here this evening. And now I'll hand this over to you.
Great. Thank you, Jean, and thank you, Stephen. I'd like to just also thank the Dramalites for co-sponsoring tonight's talk. The Gunn Museum always for the collection, the photos and documents. I'd like to thank the Frederick Gunn School Archive, which also gave me material that I hadn't seen before, and Dmitry Rimsky, who opened up his father Fedor's portfolio of set designs and costume designs. Thank you all for that. I also want to acknowledge that this talk would not be possible without the contributions of Mrs. E.H. Van Ingen, who wrote a chronicle of plays and players in Old Judea back in 1917. And she's shared a lot of material, and we wouldn't know what we know without her. So this is an unidentified photograph in the Gunn collection, and it gives you an idea of what was going on locally. As Jean mentioned, in 1996, Allison Gilchrist and I organized an exhibit on the history of the Dramalites. Carol Couch had approached us and asked us to do something. She was trying to revive Dramalites with a performance of Once Upon a Mattress. And she opened up the attic of Bryan Town Hall, where a lot of material was stored. And that also provided a lot of material for this talk. Since then, the History Club at night at the Gunn Museum did a sort of joint oral history reminiscence of the Dramalites, which is wonderful. And I encourage anybody who'd like to listen to people's memories of what it was like to ask Stephen to share it with them. And since 1996, I've also had opportunity to do a little more research into what was going on in the rest of Washington, not just the Green area. So we'll touch on that. This is going to be a really superficial glide through almost 200 years worth of performances. And as I was working on this, I got up to over 320 performances before I realized that I couldn't possibly take note of everything that was happening here in Washington. I think, there are easily 100 performances more. Basically, people have performed for almost, well, as I said, almost 200 years. The performances have taken place in Club Hall and Farmers Hall, the Hall on the Green, Town Hall, Pavilion Hall, the Gunn School, Wickham Rise, Chippewa High School, Ridge School, outdoors in the Congregational Church and the Episcopal Church, and probably other places as well. Theater is community art form. It draws on professionals and amateurs alike. Everybody pitches in. And theater is an art form that uses just about anybody, any talent. So it is really great. And community theater in particular is a way of engaging an entire community of people. And I love these particular pictures. They aren't actually theater, they're frolics, they're a circus, but they're just so much fun, and they give a sense of the kinds of entertainments that people were engaged in. The theater play acting has a number of purposes that can be moral uplift or religious. There can be community and social improvements. There can be maintaining or undermining the social order, pure entertainment, and education. And theater in Washington has done all of those things. It's still a living part of local life, and maybe more valued than ever in this COVID period. Sidney Edison, who taught at Wickham Rise in the 60s and 70s, wrote, "Through production, the student meets the playwright, actor, director, technician. He also meets the challenge of bending his talent and his will to the single goals shared by all concerned." And I think we can say that that's true of adults, everybody. Those are the goals of the performance, and the audience is just as important as the players. But this story starts in the 1830s and centers on, at least in the beginning, the Congregational Church on Washington Green. By the 1830s, the church was losing its iron grip on Connecticut communities. But it still was very much the arbiter of many, many things. And among them, theater, which was considered to be urban and immoral. And so no one would ever have dared speak the name of the church and theater in the same breath. There was a strict moral code, and the minister had a great deal of power. But by the time our story starts, this was beginning to change. The country, of course, was growing like by leaps and bounds. There were immigrants coming from all over, and the church no longer had the support of the state to back up its authority. So, the society was becoming more diverse in every sense of the word. So in 1831, this man came to Washington. William Watson Andrews was the son of a Congregational minister. He was born in Windham, and at the age of 14, he entered Yale. He was only able to stay there for a year. He had to take a couple of years off and go earn some money, which he did by teaching. And then he re-entered 2 years later and graduated in 1831. While he was at Yale, he was influenced by Coleridge and the Romantics, and he wrote a tragedy called Talcott Castle, which a society at Yale performed. He was known to be distinguished in English composition, debate, and he could sing. So he came to Washington to teach as a young man at the Academy. Okay, why is this not? There we go. One of his students was, of course, Frederick Gunn. Frederick Gunn was there from 1832 to 1833. He entered Yale in 1830. Whoa, I'm sorry. That was my hand going the wrong place. Whoops. Okay. Oh, okay. There always has to be a little bit of technology glitching, I guess. I'll back up a little bit. This is the Academy building on the Green, which is where Reverend Andrews taught school. It was owned by the church. There was a schoolroom down below and a larger gathering room on the second floor. So boys went to the academies. The churches in many towns had these academies, and they would send boys who were planning to go to college or who needed a little extra education beyond what the district schools could provide. So Gunn went to Yale. He spent 4 years there. He came back in 1837 and spent a couple of years wondering what to do with himself. And in 1839, he took over the teaching at the Academy, which had been vacant for a couple of years. At the end of his first winter term, there was an exhibition on the second floor of the Academy. He held rehearsals in a couple of buildings on the Washington Green, one of which was the now Gunn Memorial Museum in the northwest corner room. And he also wrote a burlesque on the militia system. And by burlesque, that just means a comedy. In 1842-43 year, the society probably somewhat reluctantly allowed him to present William Tell in the church. It's still being called an exhibition, not a play. That William Tell was written in 1825. Gunn had a stage built, which covered the front pews. They were the old box pews. A stage set was made from sheets that were hung as curtains with bits of evergreen sewn on them. And Gunn himself made a 6-foot-long bow out of sassafras wood, and presumably he took the part of William Tell. Another play that was performed was The Village Lawyer, and Mrs. Van Ingen thinks that John Gunn, Frederick's older brother, played the part of the lawyer's wife. And Mrs. Van Ingen says, nearly all the parts at this early day were taken by men and boys, as even Mr. Gunn would scarcely have ventured to put girls on the stage. At this time, women were never, respectable women would never speak in public to a mixed audience, ever. Other plays that he put on at this period were The Rivals, Comedy of Manners by Sheridan from 1775, possibly The Bashful Mayor, and Fortune's Frolic, which was written in 1799 and was a farce in one act. At the same time as Mr. Gunn was starting his school, his future sister-in-law, Mary Brinsmaid, also had a school for girls in this building on the town green. And they became friends. They shared letters and probably information about teaching school. Miss Brinsmaid had been to Mount Holyoke and brought back to Washington some innovative ideas about the education of women. And hopefully someday somebody will do a talk about women's education here. At the same time, Gunn was becoming increasingly active in anti-slavery matters, and it was becoming a real problem in town. And parents were pulling their students out of his school. And eventually he left town to teach in Pennsylvania. He returned though in 1849. He married Mary's sister Abigail, and I think they were both homesick and came back. And he started teaching in the academy again. By then, some of the ruckus over anti-slavery and women's proper place in public had died down, and a problematic minister had left town. So he started up his school again, but he wrote to Mary Brinsmaid in September of 1849, "I am an abolitionist among a slave-holding community. I am a teetotaler among a people where the rum maker and the rum seller are respectable men. I am a heretic in the midst of a staunch Orthodox people. I am a nonconformist in many things. In some, I stand all alone." And not only do I think that's a wonderful way of expressing himself, but it's the hyperbole of it is also touching in some ways. One of the first plays that he mounted when he returned was The Drunkard. This was a play that was written in 1844. It was first performed in Boston and was an almost instant hit and was the most popular play until the arrival of Uncle Tom's Cabin. It's a temperance play, and one bit of information I read said that it was helped jumpstart the temperance movement. It's a melodrama. Mrs. Van Ingen wrote about the exhibitions. These exhibitions were anticipated for weeks in advance and were the talk of the town for weeks afterward. They occupied 2 evenings and sometimes 3, and were held on the upper floor of the old seminary recently occupied by Miss Brinsmaid, but then empty and used as a playground for the boys in stormy weather and also as a drill room. The ground floor was the town hall, and the upper room held comfortably 100, but a far larger number would crowd in, sitting patiently from 7 until 12 o'clock on improvised seats of the roughest character. Frederick Gunn produced these plays over and over again. The Drunkard was a perennial favorite. This other drama called Past Redemption is another temperance play. And I'm sure it showcases the evils of drink. And these were kind of Gunn's bully pulpit. And also, I'm sure he saw them as a way to enforce the proper development of the boys in his charge. Another couple of plays that were produced over and over again, in fact, long after the Civil War was over, were 2 anti-slavery plays. Uncle Tom's Cabin, which we all know about, which was dramatized by George Aiken. And that's probably the version he used. There were other versions developed that were what gave rise to the stereotype of Uncle Tom and were racist, and some of them even advocated slavery. So Gunn would have used the more authentic version. And this other play, Neighbor Jack Wood, which I find a fascinating bit of Victoriana. It was inspired by the saga of Anthony Burns, who is an enslaved man who escaped from Virginia and got all the way up to Boston, where he was captured and returned. And it was a huge hullabaloo at the time. But the thing that I find most interesting about Neighbor Jack Wood is that the escaped slave is a young woman. And she is clearly the product of a slave woman and a plantation owner, because she can pass for white. And she is running away not only from slavery, but from the nefarious intentions of a man who wants to sully her good honor. And she finds her way somehow to the Green Mountains and this farmer family, the Jackwoods, and they take her in and hide her. And another young man named Hector falls in love with her, and he has to buy her from her master, and then they get married. So it's like this wonderful Victorian tale of feminine fragility and danger, and as well as an anti-slavery play. One of the things I read said that the melodrama of the woman made the anti-slavery message more palatable to audiences because it was a story that they could relate to. But I think a larger issue with that is that the play is suggesting that if even a white woman can be enslaved, then the institution of slavery is an abomination. I think it's a fascinating psychological view into the Victorian mind, personally. Another play that was a perennial favorite was The Last Days of Pompeii. A Russian painter named Karl Bryullov painted this painting, and Edward Bullier Lytton wrote a novel about it in 1834. And his novel contrasts the decadent culture of ancient Rome with older cultures of Greece and Egypt. And then rising out of all of that is the coming culture of Christianity. And there are betrayals and treacheries, and the world is exploding as the volcano erupts, and it's all very dramatic. I wasn't able to see that there was actually an official play script written, so Gunn may have adapted it himself. Mrs. Ingen writes, on the occasion of the rendering of The Last Days of Pompeii, some red and blue colored lights were introduced for the first time. You can see why they might want lights. The house was packed, the only exit by a crooked staircase 3 feet wide. Mr. Gunn, in preparing the lights, mixed them by mistake, producing a suffocating smoke, which, rolling out, made the whole audience rise and turn toward the door. Mr. Augustus Smith shouted in a voice to be obeyed, "Sit down," which every man, woman, and child did, and a panic was averted. Mrs. Van Ingen goes on to say, in 1864, The Last Days of Pompeii had a ballet of small boys trained by Baron Richard von Schmeideberg, a Russian officer banished on account of insubordination to the crown prince. I bet Gunn liked that. He taught at the school modern languages, military drill, dancing, boxing, and fencing. He designed costumes, cut out hieroglyphics, constructed props for the saga, and planned the figures for the dancing girls performed by the boys. Gunn thought it important to teach boys to dance. He felt it settled them. Also in 1864, a production of Dread by Harriet Beecher Stowe was mounted. And the story is that Gunn decided to use a live donkey that was hoisted up to the second floor of the building and put through a window. Great was the anxiety of the stage manager, writes Mrs. Van Ingen, lest the unruly animal should prematurely betray his presence by a familiar bray. But instead, he refused to make a willing entrance, being frightened by the applause he received as soon as his face was seen, and therefore, with his wagon load, he was pushed from the wings onto the stage. And I don't know, it makes sitting on those rough seats for 4 hours probably worth it if you're going to get something like that. In 1869, Erastus Hurlbert decided to build a store and just off the green, and he built this building. That same year, the Dramatic and Literary Association was formed, and their purpose was not only to produce plays, but to help pay for building a theater on the second story and making improvements to the Academy building. It was a common practice at that era to have a commercial building with a ground floor for business and then a second or even a third story for a theater space. And there are not very many of those buildings left. But you'll see a lot of theater spaces are on upper floors in the older buildings. In 1874, the Hall and Conference Room Association was formed. And in 1875, the hall was opened. Now, I'm guessing, although I don't know for sure, and maybe somebody in the audience will know, that this is the old Academy building, or that it's on the site perhaps of the Academy building. And it appears to have been built with a stage and a library. This was another venue for plays that were performed. And we have here two posters. The one on the left performed in Farmers Hall. The one on the right performed in the hall. And I'm assuming that that's the hall on the green. There are references to plays in Farmers Hall, in the hall, and in the hall on the green. So I'm assuming they're all different places. One of the things I really like about the poster on the right is down below. It says coffee and oysters sold in the library room after the plays. So I find that amusing. Plays also continue at the school, but the Dramatic and Literary Association are also producing them. Many of the same plays are being performed: The Rivals, Pompeii, Neighbor Jack Wood, Uncle Tom, Bluebeard and His Wives, and The Drunkard, and many others. They seem to be primarily melodramas and farces. We're not seeing any so-called high culture here. No Shakespeare, no tragedies that I've located. This is community theater. In the year 1870, there were performances in January, February, March, July, and December. And people also went to Newtown and Stamford and performed some of these plays. So it was a very, very active time. But at the same time, there were changes in society too. We were well into industrializing at that point, and people were working differently. They had jobs to go to, their time was more regimented, and they were more economically and socially stratified. This is partly because of the immigration and where immigrants were coming from, but also the business owners were consolidating their property and their economic might. And Washington reflected that by becoming kind of segregated in a sense between the different villages. Washington Green was occupied primarily by more well-to-do people with English and Dutch ancestry. They had been among the settlers of the town. The Washington Depot, which had started out being called Factory Hollow, New Preston, which had had quite an industrial life, and Marbledale, which had all the stone cutting mills, were more working class. And I think it's interesting to see how that developed here in Washington. In any event, the old town hall that was built down in the depot also had a stage, and there were performances there as well as up on the green. And two of the plays were Joshua Blodgett and Up Vermont Way. They were put on by the Young Men's Club in the town hall, and they're classic 19th century tales. The Joshua Blodgett is a plain speaking farmer who comes to the city, and his upstandingness, I think, overcomes the city slicker. And Up Vermont Way is a melodrama with a bad lawyer and honest people. So it's kind of classic stuff. This was a time when people were forming associations of all sorts. Village improvement societies were popping up all over the region. In 1889, the Washington Relief Club was formed to relieve suffering humanity in Washington, as they put it. And they also raised money for tar walks and the library and other good causes. There were women's clubs and fraternal organizations and the Young Men's Club, all kinds of organizations. And these are 4 playbills from a few of the organizations that were being formed toward the end of the 19th century. We've got the Volunteer Fire Department, the Washington Grange, the Warramog Social Club, and the high school students were also putting on plays. So it was a very active time all over town. In 1889 or 90, a group called the Poquasset Club took over from the Washington Dramatic and Literary Club. And they had social events, card games, and so forth. And they started performing plays as well and raising money. This photograph is not identified in the Gunn collection, but when I was going through the list of performances, I thought this might possibly be a performance of the HMS Pinafore, Gilbert and Sullivan play that was produced in 1902 in the New Milford Town Hall for the benefit of the Marbledale Village Improvement Society. That's one of my favorite pictures. Other charitable actions were taken in World War I. We had the Sister Susie Society that was formed to help provide relief to the war effort. And they created this Alsatian village as a fundraiser. And I think that that's probably Dr. Wordsby and Arthur Woodruff dressed up as Alsatian maidens. At the end of the day, for this fundraiser, they had an operetta called The Heir Apparent, which was very highly reviewed. The painting on the left was done by John Follansbee. I'm not sure which fundraiser that was for, but it seems pretty obvious it was for the war relief effort. And then later, this is a short list of some of the organizations that the Dramalites supported through their plays. This list is actually much longer. I don't know if anybody has consolidated it though. New Preston was not going to be left out of the village improvement craze, although they did it in a slightly different way. This is a picture of New Preston, which had been, as I mentioned, an industrial and commercial village, although that activity was waning and the tourist attraction of the Lake Warmog area with all the hotels and boarding houses was taking its place. And I think although the residents and the tourists disagreed about things like modern conveniences, the tourists wanted to keep the town quaint and the locals wanted to be able to get places. I think they all were able to agree that a cultural organization would be helpful. So in 1894, the site was deeded to William Hopkins, who owned the Sachem on the lake, and he later became the treasurer of Pavilion Club. In 1895, Pavilion Club was incorporated for the purpose of literary, dramatic, musical, social entertainment, public lectures, political meetings, religious services, etc. And in 1897, that founding document was amended to include making improvement in the village of New Preston, its streets, public grounds, and public buildings. That document also states the intention to purchase property and erect a building. So, which was a little bit stating an intent after the fact, because in fact, the foundations for Pavilion Hall were dug in 1896, and the building started being built in early 1897. The club was deeded the property in July of 1987, and the building was reported as being finished, everything but the painting, on July 8th, 1897. By August, a theater company from Troy, New York, was on site setting up the stage and arranging the scenery, and they produced the play Only a Farmer's Daughter. The following week, there was a performance of Little Red Riding Hood with 40 local children as the chorus, and that was a community directed production, and Pavilion Hall was off and running. In December 1897, they installed a heater, and they built a large kitchen and a dining room on the lower level. I should show you the picture. On the lower level with the capacity to seat 72 people. And the newspaper columns from here on talk about plays, dances, dinners, lectures, political gatherings, and Pavilion Hall really became a centerpiece of the village of New Preston. This is a playbill of the Farmerette. It's another World War I fundraiser for the Red Cross, but you get a sense of what was going on. And now I'm going to talk about a more difficult part of our history that is a little uncomfortable to think about. It's distasteful now with their unabashed racism and the stereotypes that persist even sometimes. minstrel shows, but they were very popular here in town. They were started in the 1830s and were popular across the country for about 100 years. So they didn't really die out until the 1930s, which is kind of shockingly recent. To begin with, they were largely urban and they catered to working class white audiences. They introduced whites to a kind of foreign culture that was also American. And there was a definite love-hate kind of activity going on. These minstrel shows gave white people new ways to express themselves. They may have introduced immigrant communities to American culture, and at the same time, they were maintaining the social hierarchy that left African Americans at the lowest level. But at the same time, they were also liberating, and the argument can be made that they helped produce the popular culture as we know it today. By the turn of the century, of the 20th century, it was no longer a working class white phenomenon, and I found several playbills at the Gunn School of minstrel shows. These are just two of them. I find it a real irony that only 20 years after Mr. Gunn's death, these minstrel shows are being performed because he had such a strong sense of ethics and believed so firmly in the dignity of everybody and the right of Black students to get a decent education. But his son-in-law and daughter who were running the school at the time clearly didn't feel the same way he did. Eric Lott, who wrote a book called Love and Theft about minstrel shows, writes, "How weird it is at bottom. Here you have a stage form that depends on caricature, yes, but a real desire on the part of white actors and performers to act like, to inhabit the bodies of Black people, to act like them, to be like them, to impersonate them." And he suggests that the increasing regimentation of society and work meant that minstrel shows offered a release from these hierarchies and constrictions of white culture. People could move differently. They could sing different kinds of music if they put on blackface. There was an opportunity for derision, of course, and maintaining a hierarchy of another sort, but also for escape. And he says that blackface meant that white people could appropriate this other culture without having basically to admit it. And he points out that Mick Jagger, the culture was transmitted to England. Mick Jagger is performing in the tradition of the minstrel show, but without having to hide behind blackface to do so, which I think is an interesting idea. This photograph is probably the Young Men's Club performance in Town Hall in 1901. And everybody was performing these Negro or minstrel shows. This is a Washington High School performance. In September 1897 at Pavilion Hall, it was reported that Stetson's troupe gave that old-time drama, Uncle Tom's Cabin, in the hall to a packed house, the largest audience since the hall was open to the public, who were well satisfied with the entertainment. That Saturday, Scott's minstrels, as they called themselves, appeared at the same place and tried to give a miserable performance to a large house who were so indignant at the fraud practiced on them that they would not allow them to finish whatever they were trying to do, as they did not seem to know themselves what their program was. We presume Scott's minstrels will never be heard from again, as they seem to be the lowest type of Danbury characters on the characters. And another newspaper report says that the audience numbered 400, and there were drunks and hooligans and a brawl as a result of that performance. But up on Washington Green in 1912, Mrs. Van Ingen says that there was no drama that summer, but a minstrel show conducted by Mr. Hodgson took the place of the drama. Mr. Hodgson defrayed the expenses of music and costumes, which were large, himself, so that almost the entire proceeds were used toward paying the debt on the hall. Well, now we're going to move to a more refined experience of theater. In 1902, this woman, Fanny E. Davies, moved to Washington and started a girls' school that she named Wickham Rise after Bishop William of Wickham, a medieval bishop. She was an Anglican, and she started her school in this building, Blythe Hall, which later became the headmaster's house at the gunnery. She was able to build a building of her own by 1907, and this was the school as it looked after that. And presumably she had a stage built in this building, although we don't know where it would have been. Because in 1914, the Wickham Rise scrapbook shows 4/5 of the Performers Club and a play being performed on a stage. That play was called A Virginia Heroine. That building burned in 1923, and in 1924, another building was built in its place, the building we all knew as Wickham, which is since also burned. I think I don't have specifics, but I think we can assume that plays were a part of the Wickham Rise curriculum. This wonderful photo is a play of Midsummer Night's Dream. And you'll notice that the girls were taking both male and female parts, as boys took male and female parts as well. Wickham Rise closed in 1943 as a result of the war, World War II. And also, I think the school had been losing ground as Miss Davies grew older and then retired. But this picture looks like it's probably in the 19-teens, I would guess. I don't know. In 1905, Farmers Hall had a small fire. It wasn't serious, but people thought that it probably would be wise to demolish the building and replace it. And so Eric Rossiter designed Club Hall, and it was opened in 1906 with a stage. And that marks the end of commercial enterprises on Washington Green. It became pretty much a residential area after that, with the post office and the drugstore the only businesses. This photograph, taken by Joseph West, was probably taken shortly after Club Hall was built. It looks like it's a choral performance, and possibly Arthur Woodruff, who was a fairly renowned conductor, was leading it. And he's another subject for a cemetery tour or a talk or something, I think. I mentioned the Pequasset Club. They founded in 1889 and took over from the Dramatic and Literary Association. They put on plays all the way through. And this in the next photograph were given by Helen Wordsby, whose family was very involved with the Pequawset Club. She gave them to us, I think, when we were doing our Drama Lights exhibit in 1996. And here's another play, also looks like from the 20s, given in Club Hall. In 1929, the old town hall was replaced with this glorious new building that was built with a stage and that had the additional benefit of being warmer in the winter than Club Hall. And then the far next year, the Drama Lights was founded. Miss Davies is said to have helped inspire the name. Drama Lights seem to have had a single mission, which was performing plays. They weren't playing cards or holding dances or anything like some of the other organizations. They had plays performed in Club Hall and in the town hall. They had big plays and little plays, and they were very active. I want to take just a minute to mention the artists that were involved with constructing sets and designing them and the costumes that were being made. Fyodor Rimsky saved his work, so we have copies of his designs. There aren't copies of other artists' work, but I think we can be pretty sure that Gibson, Faulkner, Follansbee, Esther Peck, who had some professional experience working in theaters, as well as Fyodor Rimsky, were involved in creating the magic. This photograph in the Gunn collection is labeled "Guess Who's Coming to Dinner," which befuddles me because that was a film that was made in 1967, and I haven't found any evidence that there was an earlier iteration of it. And this play looks like it's from the late 40s or early 50s. But it's a great photograph. It gives you an idea of the kinds of set design and costuming that people were undertaking. And talent was being drawn from many communities. I know when I was growing up in Woodbury, I knew people who were very involved in theater, who were our neighbors and friends. So it was sort of a regional effort. The Drama Lights did a lot of Gilbert and Sullivan. They would take the whole summer and produce them. And one of the great things about Gilbert and Sullivan is that you can get a lot of people involved. You've got choruses as well as cast members. And there's music and song and dance, and it's great, good fun. And the History Club at Night recording, Jane Boyer, I think it was, said that it was a way for young people to get together and spend the summer putting on a play, and it involved everybody. You could really have a lot of people enjoying the experience. This is the Mikado that Jane donated. Apparently, one of these actors is James Franciscus, who older members of our audience will remember as a TV and screen star in the 60s to the mid 80s. So we even gave our certain people a start here. But you can see from this photograph how many people were involved in these Gilbert and Sullivan productions. And Gilbert and Sullivan also even inspired a novel to be written. Mary Durant, who we also know as Mary Harwood, was in Patience and was Mrs. Thomas Cooney at that time. And the Newtown Bee wrote of her performance in 1947 that she was the leading comedian, the featured contralto singer, and her amusing duet with Bunthorne was one of the highlights of the evening and received at least 3 encores closing night. The book is a sort of a character study of a community as it engages in the production of patients with there's not a lot of plot, but it's a wonderful little description of the kinds of personalities who are involved and some of the behind the scenes, so to speak, carryings on. And the Connecticut Room has a copy. You can't check it out, but you could read it there, and it's a pretty easy read, and it's fun. I threw this picture in just because I love it and because it's a rehearsal of an unidentified play. It gives you a sense of the kinds of activities and involvement people were engaged in. And this is a photograph that Mary Harwood gave. She dated it 1960, but I think it's probably a few years later than that. Spoon River Anthology was produced in Town Hall with minimal sets. There was a line of straight chairs with their back to the audience, and the cast members sat facing away from the audience until it was their turn to tell their story. And I don't know if people remember, but Spoon River Anthology has different town members telling their stories from the grave. Also in the 1960s, Otis Charles came to town as the rector of St. John's Church. And I think maybe H. Siddons Mowbray's wonderful murals in the church and Rossiter's building inspired him to think about performing some plays, producing some plays. The picture in the bottom right is Fyodor Rimsky's design for the play The Zeal of Thy House by Dorothy Sayers. I'm going to read from the program of the play because I think it is it's both an interesting motivation for why Otis Charles wanted to do this, but it also points to the way Washington was changing as a community. He writes, the production of The Zeal of Thy House in St. John's was motivated by the conviction that Christianity has meaning for man's entire life. Recent centuries have denied this, and the attendant fragmentation of modern life bears tragic consequences. Not the least of these is the separation between religion and the arts. For the church, the result has been sentimentality and mediocrity. For the artists, communication declined as their communal sustenance withered, and they forgot the religious roots of their creativity. That Miss Sayers' play was written, that it is being here acted, is cause to rejoice. Small beginnings are being made. Communication between the artists, poets, painters, playwrights, sculptors, novelists, actors, and the church is one of the happy changes of our time. And so we started out looking at the Congregational Church and its absolute abhorrence of anything that struck of color or ritual or arts. And by the 1960s, we were starting to see a changing world. These are some costume designs by Fyodor for The Zeal of Thy House, Murder in the Cathedral, which was so well received, it was invited to go to Waterbury and be performed at St. John's Church on the Green in Waterbury, and then some short medieval morality plays. And these are costume designs, obviously. In 1963, Otis Charles and Father Willoughby Newton, who had been a master at the Kent School, got together and looked at the campus of Wickham Rise, which had been vacant for quite a while, and thought that it would be a great idea to start a girls' school. And they raised an enormous amount of money. They had to renovate the buildings, which were in pretty rough shape, and they built some dormitories, and they opened a school for girls that focused on the arts. And girls had to take courses in the various arts, and then in order to graduate, they had to major and do a senior project in one of the arts. The school attracted girls, ordinary girls, but also some very committed, dedicated women who went on to become professional artists in their chosen field. Linda Pearl is one of them. Sidney Edison was the drama teacher there, and I'm looking for my, she wrote in 1970 about the drama program and the value of drama in education. And she wrote, drama students wrote, acted, danced, and sang. They worked on sound, lights, scenery, costumes, and props. During the course of the school year, they spent hundreds of hours in classes, on technical crews, and in performance. And they were doing not only formal plays on stage at Club Hall, but also English classes were given over to the study of, say, Shakespeare by performing it. And one member of our audience here was in one of those plays. Also, the world outside was coming to Washington in these years. The actress Vinnie Burroughs, who is an actor, storyteller, and activist, called Walk Together Children, which she performed here as her flagship one-woman show chronicling the African-American experience. So at last, white Washington was getting to hear from actual African-Americans instead of the minstrels. In 1969, W.H. Auden, the poet, was invited to write the libretto for an opera that was being composed by the students, The Ballad of Barnaby. And I was interested last week to see that the New York Review of Books had posted the 1969 version of Auden's poem online. So that it's kind of extraordinary to me that this little tiny town and a little tiny school, there were, I think, 130 students at its biggest, we're getting world-class artists to contribute. There was a playwrights contest from the 1980s. I don't know who won it, but it had a national reach. And then in the 1990s, the Dramalites produced this play by Christopher Emerson of the Judea controversy, which was the time when the Quaker activist Abby Kelly came, and horrors spoke to a mixed audience in public. And also John Gunn and Frederick Gunn were, and others were causing a ruckus over the anti-slavery movement. And that play was performed right in the church. So also sort of coming back full circle. The Dramalites continued to perform plays, although they were getting, there was less and less enthusiasm for these big summertime plays. I think as people changed, the world changed, people became more busy. Young people maybe didn't want to give over their entire summer to something like this. People kept trying to keep it going, and for the most part, I think succeeded. There was at least one play a year for many years. And they were being produced in the Bryan Memorial Hall and at Chippewa Valley High School and out at the Town Pavilion, where Shakespeareans is now doing plays, including this year's 12th Night. So drama is still an ongoing concern here in Washington. I asked Doug Winkle, who's heading up the Drama Lights, to write me something about where we are today. And so I'll close with what he wrote. First, he wrote, the Drama Lights arose from a dormancy of several years with a production of The Saga of the Prospector's Daughter, or She Was Only a Miner's Miner, in August of 2017. We were fortunate to have offered to us by a generous Washington family the use of a vacant building in Woodbury. Through an enormous volunteer effort, we were able to transform the space into a viable, even attractive performance space. It turned out to be the perfect environment for a good old-fashioned summertime melodrama, which, as we've seen, was something that the theater people in Washington excel at. The next year found us again at the Woodbury property with a successful production of Carlo Goldini's farce, The Servant of Two Masters. Both productions and the excitement of our own space helped revive hopes and expectations for our return to a lively presence in the community. Then something happened no one was ready for. Our return back to life comes with a review of writers known collectively as the Vicious Circle. A group of writers, journalists, playwrights, critics, and poets met at the Algonquin Hotel for lunch every day in the 1920s. Their piquant observations of their time and life sheds a unique light on our own world of fascinations and distractions. A second volume is planned, but caution should be the primary objective. Our collective survival from the current health crisis should be our focus. If and when it becomes viable, we will build a second presentation of the Algonquin Roundtable in the months to come. So with the Drama Lights' continued presence in our community and Shakespeareans becoming a new force for live theater, I think we can look forward to another 190 years of live theater. And certainly after everything that the COVID has put us through, there is, I hope, a hunger for this kind of community activity that's stronger than ever. And I would like to thank you for this. And now I have to figure out how to stop share. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah.
If anybody has any questions, I don't know if there are questions in the chat or if anybody wants to speak up. I just touched the barest surface of everything. So,
Sarah, I have a question that's come up, and that is, what were the factors that brought about the popularity of theatrical productions in Washington to begin with? It seems like they existed. It started, as you're talking about, 1830s and then lasted maybe through the 1960s. But what kept it going and what were the motivations?
well, I think there's a reason why they're called plays, because they're fun. As I mentioned, they started out as kind of exhibitions of educational merit, I suppose. But when you think about pre-television, pre-cinema, pre-automobiles, people were making their own fun. And they were making their own fun in any number of ways. And they were looking forward to coming together and experiencing things. I mean, the motivations are not really that much different than they are now. Seeing live performances, having stories told through this dynamic medium, and being able to get together, and presumably, there weren't too many other opportunities for these kinds of stories to be told.
Okay, thank you. And were these participants, the actors, were they acting because they had a great desire personally to participate, or were they driven by a broad, say, market demand, for this type of entertainment?
Well, I think that it's probably a little bit of both. I think probably some students in the various schools were, that was part of the school life. So you did it that way. Some people are show-offs and love to get up in front of people and do whatever. I'm sure there were a multitude of different kinds of motivations for people. But again, I go back to it's play. It's a way that people can play together. And it's got a structure. So it's a way adults can play together.
Thank you. I think that's well said.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for this enlightening lecture. It's just been really fascinating. Thank you for introducing us to Washington's rich history of theatrical productions. And thank you all in our audience, and please enjoy the rest of your evening.
Yeah, Dimitri mentions that the Dramalites performed the Crucible, which speaks to the variety of plays that were performed here. So yeah, thank you for this incredibly rich subject. Who would think that a little tiny town would have such a history?
Yeah, it's tremendous, far more than certainly I anticipated. And I think it was just a big revelation, but it's wonderful. It's fascinating. Thank you. Thank you for sharing.
You're welcome. Thank you. And thank
All
you
right.
all for coming. I appreciate it.